just as a way of introduction, a personal introduction, and to give you a little bit of background on the data I'll be drawing on for this presentation. I've started doing research on this topic of cannabis social clubs in 2013, where while I was still working at RAND, I was tasked with the opportunity of doing a case study focusing on the cannabis social clubs in Spain. And then a few years later, between 2015 and 18, my PhD study actually focused on the case of Belgium. So there I had a little bit more time and space to do a more in-depth study of what is the phenomenon of cannabis social clubs in Belgium. And after that, I've done also some field work in Uruguay. I was a visiting researcher at the Catholic University of Uruguay in 2018. And some of those findings I'll be sharing with you here today as well. And then more recently, I've been doing with colleagues from the UK and Spain an exploratory study where we've been looking at cannabis social clubs in Europe. At the moment, I'm working on an edited book that focuses precisely on this topic, and which might be the closing of this cycle for me as well, with colleagues focusing on aspects that have to do with this model in different countries, in different contexts. We hope that this might be released next year. So watch this space if you're interested, I'd say. Now, if you allow me for a little bit of another quick advertisement, a side note here, as Georgia said, we are currently running this international survey. If you're interested or are able to share this information within your networks, we would really appreciate it. And here I'll just say maybe a quick word in Portuguese. Estamos neste momento então a participar neste consórcio internacional. Tem aqui alguma informação sobre este inquérito, tem também o QR Code que dará acesso imediato à plataforma onde podem preencher este inquérito. É um inquérito que demora relativamente pouco tempo a preencher e como é a primeira vez que estamos a realizá-lo também em Portugal, teríamos muito interesse e muito gosto em perceber qual é que são as práticas de cultivo em Portugal. Portanto, se tiverem a oportunidade de preenchê-lo ou de partilhar com outras pessoas que o possam fazer, agradeceríamos imenso. And now back to the actual topic of this presentation. Okay, so starting with the very basics. So what is a cannabis social club? Usually some of the defining features associated with the cannabis social club indicate that these are groups of adult cannabis users. So these are groups of users that get together and form this kind of non-profit association. So they usually are not motivated with the idea of generating profit. They function in a closed supply. So they are clubs for members only. So only users that have completed the process of registration and have become members of these associations are able to benefit from the activities and the cannabis that is produced by these associations. And typically this cultivation takes place in a small scale. It's only meant to meet the personal needs of those members, and it's usually organized in a sort of cooperative way. So with members helping out with the activities and the cultivation of the cannabis that is then distributed within this association. Some of these cannabis social clubs have also engaged in activism and trying to advocate for a change of cannabis policy. So that is another element that usually defines these type of associations. I should say, though, that these cannabis social clubs did not appear in a void, and I think it's important to acknowledge and to perhaps look at them embedded in a longer history of the drug user movement and of other peer-to-peer drug user organizations. For example, if we look back at the late 70s, early 80s in the Netherlands, we saw the appearance of these so-called junk unions, which were associations formed primarily by heroin users who try to share information among themselves about methadone prescription programs, also organized protests and demonstrations. This is the first picture here on the left is an example of a material that was produced by these associations. And we've also actually started the first underground needle exchange programs. So I think some of these ideas we see back in the cannabis social clubs as well. Another case are the cannabis clubs, buyers clubs or compassion clubs, which appeared also relatively in the same period in the US and in Canada, and which were also sort of similar collectives that try to provide cannabis or other products primarily for patients suffering from HIV at the time. But of course, we can perhaps think of other cooperatives, of other collectives that resemble in some shape or form the cannabis social club. So I just wanted to note that perhaps it's more interesting to think of the cannabis social clubs as part of this longer history and tradition of peer-to-peer organizations of grassroots movements within the drug user movement. With that said, the first cannabis social club started in Spain, and this is also usually mentioned as the Spanish model, the cannabis social club model, as being very, very closely associated with the Spanish context. And there are a number of particularities of the Spanish legal framework that perhaps help explain this. Firstly, it's important to note that in Spain, the possession of cannabis and the use of cannabis in private and this possession for personal use do not constitute criminally relevant behaviors. And also there had been a so-called jurisprudential doctrine of shared consumption. This was initially developed for heroin users, and basically what it meant was that it was considered that the acquisition of the substance by a group of users for their use within that closed group without an intent of further commercialization also could be equated with private use, and so also did not fall within the criminal sphere, so to say. In addition to this, in the early 90s, a new law was discussed, this Ley Corcuera, Ley 1/1992, which was then approved, and which introduced relatively high fines and administrative sanctions for the consumption of cannabis in public. And the passage of this law generated a lot of frustration among the cannabis community and cannabis users, and actually has been considered in the literature as one of the precipitating factors. So it really generated a strong counter-reaction from the cannabis movement and the cannabis activists. And we can see this by looking at the start of the first association for the study of cannabis, ARSEC, which was created within that time frame of discussion of this new law in 1991 in Barcelona, which was the first sort of known association to take this stance. They consulted the public prosecutor at the time, and they asked the public prosecutor, if we were to organize a collective cannabis plantation to be distributed then among the members of our association, would this be considered legal? And the public prosecutor response indicated that in theory, this could be done. This could be within the realms of what was legal. And so they actually went ahead and did this. They planted this first collective cultivation within the context of this association. But they, of course, ran then into trouble with the police. The police came in, confiscated all the plants. But nevertheless, this created the so-called Catalan bridge. It really was a breakthrough in the cannabis movement in Spain. And we see a lot of other associations being created following the example from ARSEC in subsequent years. And another important milestone that I just want to briefly mention is a legal analysis by two Spanish scholars, Muñoz and Soto, in 2000, where they identified what they thought would be the minimum criteria for these kinds of associations to meet in order to be able to operate within the applicable legislation. For example, they talked about the idea that the plantation sites of these associations should not be visible to third parties, should not be accessible to others, that there should be a minimum monetary transaction and certainly no commercial intent behind the sales of cannabis, that the members should be identified and known to one another, and another number of other criteria. And this was very, very, very important for the movement and quite informative. And we see these associations sort of adapting their way of working following the publication of these reports. And that's a year later, in 2001, we see the first actual cannabis social club being established, also in Barcelona. So the first time that this term was actually adopted by these associations, and perhaps even more importantly, the first time that the bylaws of this association explicitly refer to the cultivation and distribution of cannabis as part of the goals and the activities of these associations. So up until now, these predecessors, these associations for the study of cannabis, still were not as explicit about the true purpose and activities they would organize. From 2001 onwards, we see a clear adoption of the term CSC, Cannabis Social Club, and a clear mention of cannabis supply and use as part of the purpose of these associations. Now we've looked a little bit at the Spanish origins, and as I've already mentioned, they appeared in a sort of a legal gray zone, exploring these particularities of the domestic framework. But I think it's also important to take a broader look and see what other relevant legal frameworks have been the context for which CSCs have appeared. At the international level, as you probably know, and I won't spend too much time here, just a brief note to point out that, of course, within the United Nations conventions, there's very limited flexibility to regulate in this area, especially with regards to recreational cannabis. Some legal scholars have concluded that waiving prosecution on expediency principles might be possible. So at an individual level, there might be some policy tolerance or some space for that. But the introduction of an actual regulated market for cannabis using the Cannabis Social Club model, for example, would probably constitute a breach of these conventions. Similarly, at the EU level, this CSC model is not tolerated nor regulated in any EU member state, so they remain at the margins of what are the applicable legislation. And so the CSCs that have existed so far have explored these legal gray zones, these particularities of the local policies. But they remain, of course, subject to legal sanction. I included here some examples just to give you a feeling of what might be the risks that some of these people incur. So recently, a very known figure of the movement in Spain, Alberto Tillo, has been convicted to 5 years of prison for being a secretary, a clerk at one of these CSCs. Also in Belgium, not so long ago, the longest standing Cannabis Social Club, Trek to Plant, has been also involved in a legal case, and several members of the association have been convicted to up to 20 months in prison as well, and high fines as well. But also in other contexts, in Slovenia as well, the leader of the Cannabis Social Club in Maribor has also been sentenced to 1 year in prison. So just picked a few examples to illustrate that the Cannabis Social Clubs that continue to exist do so in a context of very uncertain, with a lot of uncertainty from a legal standpoint, and with risks for those involved. Nevertheless, the CSCs that have continued to operate have also sort of tried to self-regulate themselves. In the absence of state-level regulation, they have developed their own sets of rules, their own codes of conduct, their own ways of working. Here I included an example of a bylaws from one of the Cannabis Social Clubs in Belgium, and not only in these codes, but through their own daily practices. But here you really see that the Cannabis Social Clubs indicate their way of working, how many plants are cultivated, what is the price of the cannabis per gram, the opening hours, how often can members obtain cannabis at the CSC, and so on. So they, in the absence of other regulation, they have sort of built this themselves based on their own ideas about how a Cannabis Social Club should work, their own vision of the model. And so we've seen this very clearly also in these bylaws, which are, by the way, public. So these are the result of this registration as associations, and they are publicly available. This does not mean that their activities are illegal. They clearly mention, you can see here, growing 1 cannabis plant per person in a collective plantation. There is no assessment of the legality of their activities, but they do put forward and they do register as any other association would do. And they've also done this collectively. So in the last decade, we've seen the appearance of so-called Cannabis Social Club federations. These are umbrella organizations that represent a group of cannabis social clubs and that are not necessarily so much involved in the supply of cannabis, but in advocating for the Cannabis Social Club movement, trying to make the connections with relevant stakeholders and so on. We see these, and I included here some examples from Spain. CATFAC, FEDCAC are 2 federations in Spain, but you have many others in Spain, also in the UK, in Germany, and even at the European level, ENCOD has tried to develop a code of conduct for European cannabis social clubs. Of course, these are attempts by members of the movement to try to bring some homogeneity to the way they operate and to add strength by uniting themselves, but these remain, of course, voluntary codes of conduct. If we look across the Atlantic, we find perhaps the exceptional case so far of Uruguay, where there's state regulation for the Cannabis Social Club model. As you might know, in 2013, Uruguay passed a broad legislation that introduced a legal market for cannabis. They have regulated 3 channels of supply for cannabis that are available for Uruguayan citizens or residents after completing a process of registration. So how it works is, one, as a resident or citizen, has to complete a formal registration and select the channel. So only one channel is available at a time. One can change if I later decide that I would like to obtain cannabis through a different channel, that's possible, but only one channel can be selected at a time. The first channel is home cultivation, where the registered growers can cultivate up to 6 plants and may share the cannabis that they produce within their household, so with the other elements that live together with them. And the latest figures from December, I just looked at them a few days ago, pointed to over 10,000 registered cannabis growers. So these are the legal people that are operating within the legal framework for home cultivation in Uruguay. The other channel is pharmacy sales, where users can obtain up to 10 grams per week, and 2 varieties are available. Both have a THC content below 10%. I should say that there was a lot of resistance in the beginning and up until now, actually, for pharmacists to adhere to this supply of cannabis, because there was a different understanding of their role, and a lot of pharmacies did not volunteer or did not adhere to supplying cannabis through their outlets. So at the moment, in the whole country, only 14 pharmacies are actually supplying cannabis to users through this legal channel. But this is still the most popular channel. Over 43,000 Uruguayans or residents are registered to buy cannabis at a pharmacy in Uruguay. The third channel is the CSCs, which are, of course, the interesting point for today. And if we look a little bit closer on what's expected of the legal cannabis social clubs in Uruguay, in terms of access, something similar to the general framework, of course, only available for Uruguayan citizens or residents that are 18 years old at least. Then they need to register as members of only one club. And the legislator here introduced a limit in terms of the number of members that each cannabis social club can have. So in Uruguay, cannabis social clubs are only allowed to have 15 to 45 members, remaining relatively small. In terms of cultivation, the clubs are allowed to have up to 99 plants at one given point in time, and they have to develop quite detailed cultivation plans. So these are documents where they should outline which materials they use in the production of cannabis, what happens with the leftovers, who has access to the plants, and other aspects that have to do with the cultivation. In terms of distribution, it comes down to the same amount, but there's more flexibility than at the pharmacy, so they can distribute a maximum of 40 grams per month to each member. But the clubs are free to choose if that happens in one occasion or in multiple occasions during the month. Then in other subsequent regulation, a number of other requirements have been introduced. For example, the cannabis social clubs cannot advertise their activities. There cannot be any external signs of identification. So if you're walking in the street, you should not know that a certain building is hosting a cannabis social club. There are also a number of security systems that the clubs need to have in place, and they also have to have a social space for members. There are also a number of location restrictions, for instance, with regards to distance to educational or treatment centers and to other supply channels. IRCA is the national institute that was created with this legislation and that monitors the implementation of the law. So also with regards to CSCs, they play a monitoring role. So I think at this point, it's interesting to perhaps broaden our view and see what's happening now in terms of where do we find cannabis social clubs and what are they doing precisely. So as I mentioned, the whole story started in Spain with the first cannabis social clubs in the early 90s or 2000s. They continue today being unregulated. At the national level, there is no legislation that regulates the activities of these associations, and there are about 800 to 1,000 active cannabis social clubs, but the estimates vary quite significantly, and we only have some indication of the number of cannabis social clubs that are actually operating there. Just a few notes on the situation in Spain. There has been a significant increase in the number of cannabis social clubs in the last decade, especially since 2011, and mainly in Catalonia. Some authors talk really of a cannabis social club boom. Also, the cannabis industry has solidified its presence with hundreds of grow shops, of cannabis magazines, of even specialized legal services and consultancy services to set up cannabis social clubs and to help them through any legal issues they might face. There have been, as I said, several attempts to regulate the model, mainly at the regional and local level, but they have been unsuccessful so far. Usually they're blocked then at the central federal level. Interesting to note as well is that there have been some deviations from these original ethos of the model that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and some authors have identified what they've called cannabis commercial clubs. So these are larger associations that still go by the name of cannabis social clubs, but that gather thousands of members that perhaps function in a more commercial way, trying to get profit with different techniques to increase sales, and even trying to recruit tourists and others to join their association. So quite a different reality than the initial ethos of a cannabis social club, more small-scale cooperative and so on. There's also been some dispersion of what is the activist field. It seems to have lost some of its initial strength and focus. Belgium is another important setting when it comes to cannabis social clubs. There have been CSCs there since 2006. As in Spain, they remain unregulated. And despite having a continued presence since 2006, they have not reached the numbers that we've seen in Spain. So there's only a small number of cannabis social clubs in Belgium, and they function on a more small-scale level as well. So they tend to have so-called micro plantations, up to 20 plants that are cared by different people within the association. So they do not have a centralized cultivation site, but rather several smaller plantations that are taken care by some of the members of the association. An interesting development in Belgium is the appearance of medical CSC for the first time, or at least that we are aware of. This is now found in other countries as well, but that was the first case of exclusively medical CSC, where only individuals that have a recognized medical condition with a physician's note or some other documentation were allowed to join these cannabis social clubs. So non-recreational users were not allowed to be part of this association. As you can see here in the map, though, and might have guessed by all these red dots, these are the closed cannabis social clubs. Just going to try to make this go away. I'm just disturbed by looking at myself all the time in the screen. So as I was saying, this map shows the number of active cannabis social clubs, the green dots, and closed cannabis social clubs. This was around 2018 when I was finishing my fieldwork. But I would say if we were to look at it today, perhaps it would be almost entirely covered with red dots, as since 2017, some of the other clubs have also faced legal issues, and a lot of clubs have closed down or are considering closing down at the moment. So it is perhaps, and this is a question I still have, a phenomenon facing extinction in Belgium. We don't know how this will evolve in the next coming years, of course, but at the moment, the situation in Belgium is not looking very hopeful for the cannabis social clubs. Then another important setting is Uruguay, as I already mentioned, the only country so far with a state regulation for the model since 2013. And there are today about 163 legal cannabis social clubs that are supplying cannabis to over 5,000 CSC members. Based on some research I did and looking at the literature in this area, just some preliminary notes, and here these are really preliminary because the implementation of this new legislation only started recently, so I think things are likely to evolve and to change as this implementation moves forward. But it's interesting to note that differently than in Belgium and in Spain, cannabis social clubs are a novelty in Uruguay. Prior to this legislation, there were no strong presence of a cannabis social club movement or of cannabis social clubs active in the country. So they were almost created with this legislation. Of course, there was demands by the cannabis movement more generally to include the cannabis social club model in this new legislation. They were aware of the experiments taking place in Spain, and they wanted to also have this model in this legal framework. But it's a novelty nonetheless in the country. They have increasingly grown in number since the beginning of implementation. And they have played an important transition role. I should say that although the Uruguayan law foresees these three supplies channels, home cultivation, pharmacy sales, and cannabis social clubs, implementation did not start at the same time. So pharmacy sales only started mid-2017. And so in between 2014 and 2017, the cannabis social clubs were actually the only option for users that did not want to cultivate cannabis themselves, the only legal option. And so they played an important transition role there. And as we know, we are aware that there's still issues with the pharmacy sales, with shortage sometimes and long queues to access the cannabis, and resistance from pharmacies in the wider country to join the supply of cannabis. So the cannabis social clubs have played here an important transition role. Based on the interviews we did with representatives of cannabis social clubs in Uruguay, some of the perceived strong aspects and positive points of the model, especially in comparison with the pharmacy sales, related to the type of product. So they talked about having access to a gourmet kind of cannabis, of having close contact with the grower, having a larger variety of cannabis, which is not the case at pharmacies, where only two types of cannabis products are available and below 10% THC. That's not the case in cannabis social clubs in Uruguay. There is no such restriction in terms of potency. And also they valued the way cannabis was distributed. There was much more flexibility in terms of arranging for collecting the cannabis at the CSC. They had more privacy in terms of going and pick up their cannabis, which were elements that were positively appreciated. There were a number of issues also with this registration that I've been talking about. We also had some reports of unregistered CSC, so sort of parallel level of the market where you have unregistered, so in a way illegal cannabis social clubs operating as well. And the case of shared CSC membership. So that's the case of when individuals or one individual joins a cannabis social club, obtains cannabis, but then resells it or shares it with other users who are not registered as members of that cannabis social club, which is not the initial intention, of course, of having this registration system in place. Finally, another interesting development with regards to cannabis social clubs in Uruguay is that we see perhaps less attention being given to what are the social aspects of the model and of the way cannabis social clubs operate. So these were almost functioning as a dispensary point, although non-commercially, rather than a true social club with activities and with more interaction among the members. Then, besides these three contexts, which have been where most attention has been laid on, there are reports of cannabis social clubs being present in other countries, but we know very little or really nothing about the number of clubs that are present in other countries and their practices. I included here just some recent examples that caught my attention. There have been talks of a cannabis social club opening and closing, reopening in New Zealand, the Dactory, for some years now. Also, recently, this is from September of this year, I saw this report of cannabis social clubs appearing in South Africa. And just of last week, I saw this report of the first cannabis social club being established in Costa Rica. So very different contexts. And we still don't know much about the accuracy of these reports to start with, and what these associations actually do. They call themselves cannabis social clubs, but we don't know much about the activities they are doing. It was with a little bit of this in mind that we organized ourselves to run an exploratory study together with Tom DeCourt, Melissa Bone, Oscar Pares, and Julia Johansson, colleagues of mine. And we've done this exploratory study with the idea of at least within the European level to focus on knowing more about what are the cannabis social clubs doing here, and where are they within Europe? And so I should say I'm not mentioning a lot about the methods, but I'm of course happy to talk about it if you have any questions on this. I would just say that for this study, we run an online survey. This is not representative, but it was, as I said, an exploratory study. And we translated the questionnaire to all the EU languages, had it spread within our own networks, within these organizations that I mentioned before, CSC federations and other activist groups, to try to reach as many possible cannabis social clubs in Europe as possible. And so one of our first results was that there are cannabis social clubs active in 13 EU member states. And this was a surprise even to us. We thought, and the reports pointed to this being a rare, relatively rare phenomenon in Europe. But we found that at least, even with, and this is probably an underestimate, there are at least CSCs in 2018, 2019 in 13 EU member states in Europe. Portugal is not one of those, unless there are any expert informants in the room or wherever you are. Please, if you know more, let me know. I'm always curious to see what's happening in the field. But at the time we did the survey, the information we gathered pointed to no CSCs being present in Portugal as well as in other 9 countries. And for 5 countries, we could not really rule out. We had contradictory information or unreliable information. And so there might be also clubs in those countries who are not able to rule that out. So that's the first finding. More countries seem to have cannabis social clubs than we had perhaps anticipated. In terms of when they started, although we found some early experiences that confirm also the early case of Spain in the early 2000s, also Belgium, 2006, we see that really the boom of activity in terms of creating CSCs happened in the last decade. There might be a number or several explanations or hypotheses to give us some clarity on as to how or why this has happened. There might have been more awareness of the model. There might have been more contact between activists across countries. It's also worth bearing in mind that this is a period where we have witnessed a lot of changes in terms of cannabis policy in Uruguay in 2013, but also throughout the decade in multiple US states, in Canada more recently. And so the topic has certainly been on the agenda. There might also have been more local and perhaps less visible local policies that might have helped explain why more cannabis social clubs have been created in recent years. In terms of size and formality, we found great variety. The smallest cannabis social club in our sample only had 6 members, so this was a really small association, a group of users, but the largest one had 5,000 members. And the largest CSCs in our sample tended to come indeed from Spain, confirming that idea of having perhaps larger associations taking place or being developed in the country. In terms of why or how one joins a cannabis social club in Europe, we found mainly 3 to 4 requirements for membership. And the most common one had to do with age, being 18 in most cases. In some cannabis social clubs actually set the threshold at 21 years old, being vouched by someone who was already a member. So in this case, one could only become a member of a cannabis social club if he or she was recommended by someone who was already a member. And then already being a user of cannabis. So the idea here would be that they are not encouraging, or they are not sort of a shop for any individual trying to experiment, but they are more meant for individuals that have already some contact with cannabis use. Most had been registered as associations, as I said. So this, despite the lack of regulation, they have taken these steps to formalize their existence, so to say, at the national, regional, or local level, and they've formalized themselves as associations, as non-profit associations. Then what we were primarily interested in was to know more about the kinds of things they were doing. So what are these cannabis social clubs actually characterized by, or what are their main features? And so we asked them about these and focusing on the past 2 years of their activity. The top one initiative that the cannabis social clubs were involved with had to do with information sharing. So they told us they were sharing a lot of information about new findings with regards to cannabis or cannabis properties, with policy changes and so on. But also they were organizing educational or informative events themselves. include here an example of a workshop that was organized by CSC in the UK, but also in Belgium. There have been lectures on the medical use of cannabis and the medical properties of cannabis organized by local cannabis social clubs in collaboration in some cases with other stakeholders. Here's another example from Spain, where the CSCs offered a training for staff on harm reduction and management of risk in collaboration, in this case, with Energy Control, an NGO that works in the field of harm reduction. And so this is just to give you a sense of the type of information and educational activities that the CSCs reported doing within the past few years. Cannabis supply was also an important aspect of their functioning. 3 in 4 clubs in our sample told us they were currently cultivating and distributing cannabis among their members, and most were distributing herbal cannabis and hashish, although in some cases other products were also available. It's interesting to note that although most were active suppliers, still 21 cannabis social clubs were not distributing any cannabis, but still call themselves cannabis social clubs. They still thought that this was what they were, despite focusing perhaps on other activities only and not on supplying the substance to their members. Then, perhaps, although to a lesser extent, the clubs in our sample also told us that they were trying to be social, live up to that idea of being a true social club. They organized, and this is the example I include here, festivals with music shows, and also with speeches from activists. They also organized the so-called cannabis cups, which are competitions among growers of different cannabis social clubs, but they were also just a social space where members could gather and enjoy their company, or they had also all sorts of entertainment materials at the clubs, mainly in Spain. Another area of importance for the working of cannabis social clubs has to do with activism. So a significant number of the clubs in our sample were active in trying to lobby and establishing contact with key stakeholders to try to advocate for a change in policies. This is a picture I took at the European Parliament in Brussels, where an event was hosted that had to do with cannabis policies, and counted with the representation of representatives of cannabis social clubs in Belgium, who talked about their proposal, their ideas, and their experiences. But they've also done protests and demonstrations, sort of another way of calling attention to their demands and to ask for a change in this area. Now, what can we take away from these? I thought we'd perhaps focus on the initial concept I gave of what a cannabis social club is. So it was relatively simple. Small organization, non-profit, producing cannabis in a cooperative way, trying to have this social atmosphere and this contact between the members, also with this activist role. But as I think I tried to show here today, and as we've seen the history of cannabis social clubs and how they've developed, not only in Spain, but in the other contexts where they have appeared, the picture has perhaps become less clear. I included here 2 citations from Research ID because I think they illustrate the extremes quite well. So on the one hand, we have CSCs that think that we always have to remember that we are political action more than a cannabis shop. On the other hand, you also have references to clubs that are open to tourists with low quality cannabis, high prices, that are like coffee shops. And so there seem to be different ideologies, different visions of what a cannabis social club should be and how they should operate in practice. And so in fact, when we look closer at these, this is a typology I draft based on the research in Belgium and what is known about CSCs in other contexts. You see that perhaps we almost need to deconstruct this idea of cannabis social club, and that perhaps speaking of one cannabis social club model or the cannabis social club model perhaps hides very important empirical realities. As we've seen here today, there are very large cannabis social clubs that still think of themselves as cannabis social clubs that operate perhaps in a more commercial way, but there are also still cannabis social clubs that collaborate with harm reduction organizations and that are truly social in their way of operating. There are a lot of differences and a lot of richness in how cannabis social clubs have developed their activities. And now perhaps the follow-up question is, why is this relevant? Why is this of value to know this? I would argue that at the first level, it's interesting and it's important to document and to be aware of the richness of these practices, because we shouldn't forget that for the most part, this has been a grassroots movement. So this is almost this is a reflection of the user's agency in shaping this model and putting forward what they think are the key ideas and the ways CSCs should be working in practice. But then also at the second level, perhaps when considering policies in this area, it is interesting to think that as the discussions on cannabis policy continue to develop, cannabis social club model has often been put forward as a middle ground model. And the assumption there is that the cannabis social clubs perhaps might be in between solution between prohibition and commercialization that perhaps do not have the same kind of risks involved in these more commercialization models, meaning that they restrict access to members only. They do not have, they're not based or they do not involve the creation of a large cannabis industry, but they remain small scale cooperatives. There are no marketing techniques, no advertisement, no further incentives to encourage increases in consumption or in starting consumption. The types of products produced are relatively limited to the more traditional form of the substance. And so these are some of the ideas as well in terms of harm reduction that cannabis social clubs might play a role here by offering sort of peer-to-peer contact, peer-to-peer harm reduction, for being a space where, for example, the staff can detect perhaps more problematic use and that collaborates with other agencies. So these are some of the assumptions that we have when thinking of this cannabis social club model in terms of policy, but I think understanding these nuances and these complexities might be informative when thinking of the space that cannabis social club can occupy when thinking about also designing policies in this area. And with this, I think I end here. I hope you're still there. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to hear your questions, also in Portuguese if you prefer.